This is Peter Connor. I'm in the recording studios of the Barnard Centre for Translation Studies, and I'm joined today by Serge Gavronsky, poet, translator, and a colleague of mine in the French department, where he is Professor of French. Thank you for joining us, Serge. Serge, I know that Serge Gavronsky was born in Paris. Where was the translator born?
Much later. Really much later. Probably a few efforts in college. I went to Columbia College. And at one point I had been given a 17th century text by both my professor and my advisor. And so that
and who was that?
That was Nathan Edelman. And that must have been in 1952. My first and I believe very unsatisfactory effort. Thereafter, if you so wish, simultaneously with writing poetry a lot in the years following that, after graduation, and after getting a doctorate in European history with Jacques Barzin and Lionel Trilling, I began very seriously in translating contemporary French poetry. Most of the poets I knew. Others, especially a considerable number of French women poets who all argued against women poets. They considered them quite plainly as poets. And so in that little anthology which Southern University Press published, I deleted woman, and they were quite satisfied with the translation. It was bilingual, as well as the facing. On the left, the French, on the right, my translation.
Let me just ask, since we're here to talk about matters of translation, about that practice. You're talking about a volume that has both the original text and the translation facing. En regard, as they say sometimes in French. And I noticed that in another volume, Towards a New Poetics, which is also bilingual, you have the French originals following the translations that you have made of a number of distinguished poets. There are some poets, your friend Emmanuel Houcard, for example, who would be against the whole notion of bilingual publications, and they feel that it's an inappropriate way to present poetry at all. So you're in favor of these bilingual editions?
Not only Emmanuel Houcard, but Claude Royer-Journoux called it ping pong. You kept on looking at the French and then making sure that there was some collaborative effort on the translator's part to take the, in quotes, original most seriously.
So you read two poems, and in some sense you're not really reading, you're evaluating or checking. This is the objection made to that kind of a publication. But you've been quite insistent in your publications that the two languages be represented.
I think one of the reasons, pedagogically speaking, is the French is pedagogically interesting. The French is there, and if you yourself are interested in double-checking the translation, then you learn about not only the value, if there is one, in the English translation, but the vocabulary. So I think it's a double adventure, and I always thought that apart from my own work, which has no facing, it was a very productive effort, and as you know, there's a great deal of correcting. There's no such thing as sort of instantaneous doing the English and thereafter checking it out with the French and revising. We're always revising. And that, I think, is a great advantage for the translator. You learn as much as you teach.
Well, you mentioned the pedagogical value, and that reminds me, of course, that you're a teacher and that you're also in an institution of higher learning. This is an interesting fact in and of itself. Is there any, as a poet, I'm thinking now primarily, as a poet, is there a tension between being in an institution of higher learning and your identity, such as it is as a poet or as a creative writer. Where there might be in France, for example, I know that you've spoken to a lot of French poets, and some of them have evoked this, that it would be there's a barrier between university life and creative or literary life sometimes in France that there is not here, but perhaps you feel it differently.
I've always believed, teaching 20th century French poetry, which I have done for many years, that it is essential for students to weigh both resemblances between French writing poets and an introduction to the moving complexity of French poetry. As one could say for English poetry, American poetry, let's be more precise. So that I start a 20th century French poetry course with, to play on the avant-garde, with Lautréamont, Rimbaud, Valéry, poets whom I think were not only read, digested, but simultaneously condemned by what they believed was the necessity not to mimic, not to double what had been done in the past, but to inaugurate, if that is a conventional term, something new. And so, for example, Dada, or Apollinaire, or Surrealism. And I think students are, I hope, very taken by simultaneously the chronology, but what occurs among poets, admiration or rejection. And consequently, that sort of dialectical relationship is pedagogically, I think, very worthwhile. And I go right to contemporary. As you know, I've done a lot on Francis Ponge, who generally is radically opposed to lyricism on the one hand and what he calls humanism. That is rather shocking to American students who've always associated those two words with the value of poetry. It speaks both personally, that is the lyrical, placing the first person pronoun as the definer of what will follow. Now, this may have been good in the 16th century, and many poets, of course, have done that after the 16th, but there has been a willful diminishing of that first person singular. And humanism, from Ponge's point of view, is the destruction of the presence of the poet within the poem, to make it speak for itself.
Such that the status of the I, should it appear, is radically different than the status it might have had back in the time of Villon or some others. Has theory, from the way you speak and also from things I have read, I know that you're interested in literary theory and have followed the developments very closely through structuralism and up into postmodernism. The notion of écriture, which is associated with Jacques Derrida, has that played an important part in the way you think about teaching poetry and also in the way you think about writing poetry or translating poetry?
I think there are probably two answers. French poets, especially after the war, that is, after the resistance, René Char, for example, were, as one might suspect, great readers. So whether it be Heidegger, Husserl, or Sartre, depending on the moment, or Derrida, as you have just mentioned, poets do not exist in the wings of thought. They believe that their culture is multiple, that they do not represent a unique voice, somehow cut off from other preoccupations. It could be a Marxist preoccupation. It could be, obviously, a Lévi-Strauss structural, so that when you teach very contemporary poets, for example, Ponge, one of the ways of approaching his things, as he calls it, le parti pris des choses, is to recall other philosophers who have equally been very concerned with that particular aspect, absorbed, integrated within at least the mind and the emotions, why not, of contemporary poets. Jacques Roubaud, for example, who is a mathematician and a translator and a major poet, and someone who has dealt with playwriting, would, in an interview which I had with him, play simultaneously on the presence of formulas, that is, mathematical preoccupations, and his passion for the Middle Ages, for the troubadours, for example. Simultaneously, someone like Henri de Luy has clearly written about the songs of the troubadours, and others, like Aragon again, have written explicitly praising their women, so to speak. Elsa, for example.
Yes, indeed.
Picking up what they assume to be magisterial anti-20th century or pro-20th century interpretations, translations, if you wish.
You're someone who is capable of translating in both directions. You're perfectly bilingual. Has that, generally speaking, been a help in your translation, or has there been any kind of hindrance or interference, the fact that you are bicultural and are so perfectly familiar with both languages?
I don't think so. Personally, I see no conflict between myself, to take myself as an example, and writing in English and writing in French. The only thing I can say is there are fewer correspondences thematically. And if the themes are different in approach, so is the language. But that, in a sense, is a cultural manifestation embedded in my own education and a bilingual existence. I exist in two languages, and I don't want to vitiate the one to ignore the other. So, no conflict.
Emmanuel Ocard, to quote him again, says that French is a very static language.
Static?
Static. That it doesn't move. That it doesn't allow for innovation. That neologisms last a year or two at most.
I don't believe in that, because the poets with whom I've had lengthy conversations do not repeat themselves from year to year. They are aware of what is happening in poetics, as we say, given the time within which they live. So Ocard himself has gone through a number of, I hate to use the word, phases. You go back to his very original poems and you look, let's say, 20 years later, and it has changed. The topics have changed, the structure of the poem has changed, the involvement, for example, of prose inscribed within a poem, which is no longer, in quotes, lyrical, where you cannot find, even if you try, rhymes. This is something which has been formally, willfully excluded. There are alliterations. You cannot write, in a sense, consciously or unconsciously, without allowing language to play with itself. You don't calculate alliterations. So Emmanuel has been writing prose, translations, organized translation events at Royaumont, which is a magnificent monastery outside of Paris. And so he is very much aware of that. And finally, Ocard and many others who are part of that select group are great readers of American poetry. And so whether they translate them or we assume that they have digested American poetry. And there again, it's a highly specific choice. Example, no Allen Ginsberg. That is, beats are not influential because the French are closer to what we might call formalists. And so Olson or Duncan or Zukovsky are much more attractive in their understanding both of the theory of poetry and poetics and the practice. All you have to do is crack open a book by the ones I have just mentioned, and you will see concordances between what hypnotizes, literally, what seduces French poets. When I say French poets, I'm talking about a very small group. And it's a group amusingly divided between what happens in Paris and what happens in Marseille. Those are two sites. They're not always antagonistic, but perhaps the sun in Marseille, perhaps again the troubadour tradition in the south is an acknowledged or something which has seeped into their own work.
You mentioned the interest of French poets in American culture, and you're a poet in two languages and in two cultures. Do you prefer Chandler or Chateaubriand?
Chateaubriand is a phenomenally gifted writer. And he is a complex writer. If you think about the apparent subject matter about le génie du christianisme, it's not only a topical question, or Le Voyage à Jérusalem, if I remember the title, but it's a question of his feeling for language. These are beautifully written texts, and Francis Ponge, 20th century, obviously, had great admiration for Chateaubriand, not obviously for his Catholicism or his geographical appreciations, but the way he wrote. So it cuts in a number of ways.
Can I ask you, personally speaking, how you write your own poems? A naive question, where they come from?
It's a very thorny question because as one, I don't put the emphasis on my lyrical eye, writes, it is simultaneously oneself being outside of oneself, not to quote Rimbaud, I is another, but insisting unconsciously that what you are writing describes simultaneously another aspect of yourself. An aspect doesn't appear necessarily in conversations, but also in writing there is, as it is in translation, an enormous rereading. When you write, perhaps instantaneously, I've done a lot of poems, they're all handwritten, and then I reread them, and I say, generally speaking, I like to foreshorten them. I think that a lengthy line for me is too long. I like precision, but I also like to allow the music of language to manifest itself. And the briefer, the more acutely audible. I'm very interested in the audibility of language and subject matter. So when you combine, let us be crude about this, music and text, it's very difficult to separate one from the other. As you know, I've been translating, together with a friend, François Dominique, a magisterial text by Louis Zukovsky, one of the lesser-known objectivist poets, and a very close friend, both of Pound and of William Carlos Williams. And if one looks, it's a whole book with the title of the first letter of the alphabet, A, very complex to analyze. You see simultaneously autobiographical material, that is, let's say, who he is as a poet, as a Jew, as a political individual. You see that. But you also see his passion for Spinoza. Spinoza is a figure which accompanies Zukovsky. At one point he says, anytime I go to the country, I take Spinoza with me. Indicative, this is very clear, that his references are very multiple. Marxism, yes, because in the 30s he was very much aware and sensitive to that, and in A, there are pages and pages of violent criticism of American railroad magnates, etc.
You're, in some sense, I don't know if you regard yourself as an exile, an expatriate, someone who has left your place, your country of birth, and yet has remained very, very attached to it. Is there a sense in which your work as a translator is a work of nostalgia or of almost of mourning?
That's a fascinating question. I've never thought of it that way. I've thought of it in terms, translation, in complex significance, as a bridge. The bridge, I have...
As a bridge back.
As a bridge back, but also as all bridges, willfully or unconsciously, going to another site. And that site is the pedagogical experiences I've had at Columbia, but reading American poets, but reading French poets. So I've never really acknowledged, it may be there, of a radical distinction between the one and the other. I tend to be more lyrical in English than I am in French.
Ah, that's interesting.
And that may be because I feel differently in this country, where other poets whom I both know and do not know. Take someone like William Carlos Williams, very autobiographical and admirable. The fact of being a doctor, or Wallace Stevens, an insurance executive, I think plays on the rigor, but also the specificity of the way they not only look at the word, but look at themselves exposed within the word. So whatever happens to me that is binational, I think is absolutely adequate observation for poets. They are multiple, and very frequently they so admit it. They may be professors, or they may be activists. I think of Anne Waldman, for example, whose vocal interpretation of her own poetry is an essential definer. But she's also a professor. She's also someone who, for the last 25 years, has taught. And when you teach, you really can't gesticulate madly as she does. You cannot raise your voice to such a pitch that it becomes more important or significant than what you're saying. And in her case, this is very true. The friendship between the oralization of poetry and the content of poetry.
There will be an event at Barnard College on the 20th of April, which is a tribute to yourself, whoever that is, a tribute to Serge Gavronsky. And you chose as a title for that event, Conflict in Translation. And we'll be bringing some translators. Lydia Davis will come, Richard Sieburth, Caws, Suzanne Jill Levine will come, and we'll discuss that matter. Is translation a conflictual act for you?
I
Or
would
what?
say no. It's not a conflictual, it's an attentive one. I think anyone who writes, and I, as you know, also write novels. I'm finishing now my 5th, and I have a draft for the 6th. I think I'm as demanding of myself and of the languages that I use, then I expose myself in rereading poetry. I do not make necessarily a distinction between prose and poetry. And as we all know, those of us who are sensitive to Baudelaire, for example, or Rimbaud, the prose poem is a radical departure from anterior expressions, let us say Lamartine. And so writing prose, you correct. And I correct to such an extent, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever finish it. They are also, if I have to finalize this, the antithesis of lengthy interpretations of whatever is said in a novel. And so for me there may not be a fundamental space between what I think I'm doing in poetry, what I feel that I'm doing in poetry, and what occurs in prose. And the prose very frequently is interrupted by quotes. I'm now working more than I've ever done before, and I have quotes from a great number of individuals, single line quotes, which break up the apparent continuity of content, of thought. And I think for me those are very interesting from a musical point of view, if you wish, as obviously from a contents point of view, distracting the reader, informative the reader, and establishes connections, if you want, from one language to the other. Consequently, a major enterprise in writing the prose, and a micro insertion, which at times, from my point of view, takes over the stage, is even more pertinent. It doubles my own appreciation of language. And the title of the one I'm working on is called The Silence of Memory, or Remembrance of Things Present. So I'm very, very sensitive, obviously, to many poets, for example, Freud, who have spent a great deal of time recuperating, analyzing, rejecting, covering over, establishing what, for me, within a novel and within a critical project, are very justified. I can argue against it, as I also do, but I think it's fundamental, as the title indicates, that one cannot obliterate oneself. There's a certain gentleman by the name of Marcel Proust who obviously was so enormously preoccupied that his title I slightly modified humorously to play on my own interpretation. And I think all writing, if one wants to generalize, are indubitably private made public. We are in a situation, later someone else, later a critic or another poet may say, oh yes, because you have translated so-and-so, without you knowing it, it has seeped within your own poetics. Sure, if reading is something which feeds one's imagination, but also critical acumen, then it's true. We are who they are as much as we are transformers, not necessarily translators, but we read, appreciate, and not necessarily understand the fullness. One has to, if they're still alive, question these very poets, and they may say, you're off base. Claude Réjourneau once described Louis Zukovsky as one who had systematically expunged metaphor. Well, if you read A, that's an absolute misreading of the poem. There are infinite metaphors. So if he did that, it's again against lyricism. You do not want to introduce such terms.
Serge, the time we can spend talking is limited by the size of the audio file we can process. So I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you very much for your comments today, and I hope that our listeners will enjoy listening, and will also enjoy listening to you read some of your poems, which I'm going to ask you to do, and which we will put on a separate file.